she had great faith. She truly believes that there's an afterlife, that she'll be wonderfully received in the arms of a loving God, and therefore did not fear death. And as a result of her soul being comforted on the deathbed, my soul is comforted.
That was President George W. Bush this week, remembering his mother, First Lady Barbara Bush. In my exclusive interview on Wednesday with the former Commander-in-Chief and First Lady Laura Bush, thousands are expected at today's public viewing in Houston for the Bush family matriarch. Among those attending tomorrow's funeral services will be First Lady Melania Trump, President Obama and Michelle Obama, along with President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, all expected to attend. My next guest has worked closely with the Bush family. Joining us right now is the former U.S. Attorney under President George W. Bush and Belmont University's College of Law Dean Alberto Gonzales. He is also the author of True Faith and Allegiance, a story of service and sacrifice in war and peace. Mr. Attorney General, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Always good to be with you, Maria.
First, your memories of Barbara Bush. I know you were very close and still are with the Bush family.
Well, Barbara Bush really was a remarkable woman, and in the coverage that I've listened to the past few days, I don't think I've heard a negative word from anyone about the influence and impact that this woman had. You know, I think the last time I spoke with her was several years ago. I introduced her at an event in Texas for a women's group, and she spoke primarily about her family. And from my perspective, the way that she raised George W. Bush, and he became the kind of man that he was, that would give someone like me the opportunities to serve as White House counsel, to serve as the Attorney General of the United States. Obviously, those decisions had a profound impact on my life, and I think that her greatest legacy will truly be her children, and I think that they will then push that legacy forward to their children, and so really, really remarkable life, and I think one that we should all try to emulate.
It's true. I love the fact that what was most important to her was family, faith. You know, she was tough as nails and certainly was serving her country as being First Lady, but she had an incredible faith and incredible loyalty to family, and was married to H.W. for 73 years. That is really remarkable. How nice is that? Yeah.
And let me just say that I think people underestimate the importance of spouses to someone in politics, because politics can be so rough and so demoralizing at times, the criticism that comes with the decisions you have to make.
Yeah.
And to have that spouse stand by you, it is so important, so necessary in order to continue to move forward through some very difficult times.
I was honored to talk with them both on Wednesday. Really, I was, Mr. Attorney General. Let me ask you about this. Of course, we have a new member of the president's legal team now. The president tapping 3 new lawyers, including former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, in an effort to push along the Russia probe. America's mayor telling the Washington Post yesterday, quote, "I'm doing it because I hope we can negotiate an end to this for the good of the country and because I have high regard for the president and for Bob Mueller." Your reaction?
Well, I think certainly Rudy Giuliani is well known and well respected, and I think he'll have a very clear understanding of how the process works from the prosecutor's perspective. I think he's likely to have more influence with respect to President Trump than with respect to Bob Mueller. I think Bob Mueller is going to continue down the trail and continue to do the work as he has been doing it. But I think with respect to Mr. Trump, I think Mr. Giuliani can inform Mr. Trump, President Trump, as to what is expected, what is a normal course of an investigation, and what are realistic expectations about when this investigation is going to be completed. So again, I think from my experience with Bob Mueller, this is not going to have an effect on the way that he believes this investigation should move forward and conclude, but Mr. Giuliani could certainly have an influence with respect to President Trump.
Your Honor, let me ask you about the politicization that has occurred in so many of these agencies, these government agencies. Mark Penn, in an op-ed in The Hill, writes this: "They were the leadership of the FBI, the CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence under President Obama. It becomes clearer every day that they were the real abusers of power in this drama." And we know now that the Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz has issued a criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. related to fired FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. for lying under oath. Your thoughts on where this goes? What's the process now that there was this referral of criminal charges? It goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Right. Well, the U.S. Attorney will simply evaluate the information provided by the Inspector General and make his or her, I can't remember now whether or not the U.S. Attorney is a female or male, but make a calculation as to whether or not there's enough here to open a criminal investigation. And they may very well conclude that, no, we think enough's been done here and we're not going to move forward. Let me just say, as a general matter, how disappointed I am about even the suggestion that there's been politicalization within the Department of Justice, including the FBI. I think that does great damage to the institution. And my sense is that because of the mistakes made by the leadership within the Department of Justice, including the FBI, that is really it's starting to cause a rift between leadership and the career investigators and prosecutors, and I think that's very unfortunate. I think they're embarrassed and they're angry about some of the decisions made by the leadership, and I think that's very, very unfortunate. And so Jeff Sessions has his responsibility is to keep that ship together. And he needs to come out there and speak to the groups, speak to the career folks, and let them know that any kind of politicization going forward is not going to be tolerated. We cannot accept that here in this country as citizens. We cannot have a Department of Justice that's politicized in any way.
Right. Well, look, I agree with you. I think, broadly speaking, the FBI is made up of wonderful men and women who try every day to do their best to keep us safe and to hold the rule of law. But I mean, give me a break. Is there any question that there wasn't an abuse of power at the top, that there wasn't a cabal of people like Andrew McCabe, like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who we've been reading their texts, that tried to dictate the results of the election and make an insurance policy to make things difficult for Donald Trump? Well,
there certainly appears to be evidence of that occurring. Again, we don't have all the information. We don't have all the facts. And I think we'll learn more as if the U.S. Attorney moves forward with an investigation. So, again, but even the mere allegation, the mere suggestion that something like this may have occurred within the upper levels of the Department of Justice is very disappointing and should not happen.
It sure is. Mr. Attorney General, it's good to see you, sir. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate you joining us this morning.